In this lecture, we begin part two of the somatosensory system, and we're going to start with a definition for the motor unit. And the motor unit refers to a single motor neuron and all the muscle fibers that that single motor neuron innervates in some distal muscle. And when we think about the motor unit, the alpha motor neuron is the one that comes to mind. And the cell body of the alpha motor neuron is located in what's called the ventral or anterior horn of the gray matter in the spinal cord. And it's this motor neuron that innervates what are called extrafusal muscle fibers. And these are the muscle fibers that are responsible for generating muscle force. A second motor neuron located in the spinal cord that has very similar properties as the alpha motor neuron is something called the gamma motor neuron. But the gamma motor neuron is physically smaller than alpha motor neurons with respect to the cell body, and there are far fewer gamma motor neurons than there are alpha motor neurons. Now, the gamma motor neuron does play eventually will play a sensory role. It's a motor neuron, so it sends out efferent signals, but these are the motor neurons that innervates what are called intrafusal muscle fibers, as we'll define a little bit later on here in this video. And these are muscle fibers not unlike the force generating muscle fibers, but these ones are found inside the sensory organ of muscle tissue called the muscle spindle. Now, the muscle spindle, as just indicated, is the major sensory organ of skeletal muscle, and these are long, thin fibers that are embedded inside a muscle and are surrounded by extrafusal muscle fibers. The muscle spindle, being a sensory organ, is found in greater concentrations. So, per volume of muscle tissue, there are a larger number of muscle spindles in muscles in the hand, forearm, and the neck region. And because these are sensory organs, if they are in greater concentrations in certain muscles, then these muscles have a greater sensitivity to position and velocity, as we'll describe in this unit. Just some estimates of how many muscle spindles are in the adult human body. Some estimates range between 25,000 and 30,000, with approximately 4,000 in each arm and 7,000 in each leg. And some researchers have attempted to estimate and predict the number of muscle spindles in a particular muscle that is largely predicted by the muscle mass. So the larger a muscle, the more muscle tissue, the more muscle spindles will be in that muscle. And the major function of the muscle spindle, being a sensory organ, is that it functions to monitor changes in muscle length as a function of the velocity. So, not just the lengthening of a muscle, but the speed at which that muscle changes length. And in this illustration, we'll see this illustration of the muscle spindle. And what's important to understand about the muscle spindle is that it gives rise to sensory neurons. And the major sensory neuron coming out of the muscle spindle is what's called the group 1A afferent. So afferent indicates that this is bioelectrical signals that are traveling from the periphery towards the spinal cord. Therefore, these are sensory. And because they're classified as group 1A, these are sensory neurons that are large and myelinated, indicating that these bioelectrical signals transmit very quickly. If we take a look at this bottom part of the picture, here we isolate one region of the biceps brachii muscle, and the large number of what you see here in these cylindrical shaped cells are what are called the extrafusal muscle fibers. These are the muscle fibers that we typically think about, the muscle cells that produce muscle force. But these are called extrafusal, indicating that they're outside of the what's called the fusiform shaped muscle spindle, and you see that right here, right in the middle of the picture. And the muscle spindle is bordered by a fibrous capsule that is connected to the extrafusal muscle fibers, but embedded inside the muscle fibers. And once we open up that fibrous capsule, what we find inside are what are called intra, for within, muscle spindle muscle fibers. So the muscle spindle is the entire organ you see here in the middle, and that entire organ is bordered by the fibrous capsule. And when we see inside, we have these muscle cells, which are somewhat similar to the extrafusal muscle fibers. Now, it's important to note here once again that the extrafusal muscle fibers are the ones that are responsible for producing muscle force. Intrafusal muscle fibers produce force, but that force does not contribute to the force output of the muscle. The force produced inside the muscle spindle will serve a sensory function. And what you see coming out in this particular case, here we see the group 1A sensory axons. So the intrafusal muscle fibers are controlled by gamma motor neurons, and the red here, the structure that is winding around the intrafusal muscle fibers, are the sensory axons that will transmit bioelectrical signals towards the spinal cord. And in this microscopic image, we see here that at the very bottom left-hand corner, we have the label indicating the striated muscle fibers, and these are our extrafusal muscle fibers that produce force. And we see a very faint picture in this picture, the capsule of the muscle spindle, and buried inside that capsule are the intrafusal muscle fibers. And what we see here in these two separate labels, we have different types of intrafusal muscle fibers. One referred to simply as a nuclear bag fiber, it's intrafusal, and the nuclear chain fiber, which is also intrafusal. And the nuclear bag, nuclear chain is reference to how the nuclei, the nucleus containing DNA inside these muscle fibers, are arranged. The nuclear bag fibers, you see the nuclei clustered centrally in the muscle fiber, whereas the nuclear chain, the nuclei appear to have a chain-like organization, a more linear rather than clustered appearance. So the extrafusal muscle fibers, once again, are the force-generating muscle fibers. These are innervated by alpha motor neurons. The intrafusal muscle fibers are located inside the muscle spindle. And when the intrafusal muscle fiber is stimulated, that will lead to an elongation of the muscle spindle. And when the muscle spindle is elongated, its overall function is that it maintains the sensitivity to stretch. What is stretching here? The entire muscle. So when the entire muscle stretches, so does the muscle spindle. But if the muscle shortens, so would the muscle spindle. But activation of the intrafusal fibers will maintain that sensitivity to stretch. As indicated on the previous slide, the nuclear bag fibers are intrafusal muscle fibers, so they're muscle cells, but these are relatively thick, and the nuclei are clustered within the central region, and these give rise or contain group 1A and group 2A afferents. So although the nuclear bag fiber would be activated by an efferent, E-F-F-E-R-E-N-T, motor neuron, the gamma motor neuron, they will also give rise to sensory information, which is afferent. The nuclear bag fibers are described and characterized as being dynamic. And what that means is that as a muscle is moving, so particularly when a muscle is stretching, the sensory afferents here will discharge high frequency impulses towards the central nervous system. These fibers are also described as being static. which means that impulses along the afferent sensory axons continue to transmit once that muscle is held at a new length. So even though the muscle is not moving, but as it's held at a new length, discharges continue along those sensory axons. The nuclear chain fibers, as illustrated on slide number 5, are thinner than the bag fibers, and the nuclei are more spread out throughout that intrafusal muscle fiber and appear to have a chain-like appearance. And the nuclear chain fibers give rise to group 2 afferents. These still transmit bioelectrical signals quickly to the central nervous system, but not as quickly as group 1A. And the nuclear chain fibers are largely considered to be static, in that when a muscle is held at a new length and not moving, these fibers, these group 2 afferents, will continue to discharge action potentials towards the spinal cord. Coming back to the motor neurons that control these muscle fibers, we talk about this concept called alpha-gamma coactivation. Alpha referring to the alpha motor neurons controlling extrafusal muscle fibers, gamma motor neurons, which control the intrafusal muscle fibers, and both are activated at the same time or co-activated. And because they're both located in the cell bodies are located in the ventral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, they're simultaneously activated. So if we take a look at this illustration at the very bottom, we locate the ventral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. And this illustration depicts a cell body for an alpha motor neuron. Located beside it, but still inside that ventral horn, is the gamma motor neuron. And so when we think about the motor unit, the alpha versus gamma, we typically associate the alpha motor neuron as part of the motor unit per se, because the motor unit is part of the final common pathway in controlling movement through the control of muscle contraction. Both types of motor neurons are also described as through their threshold. So a threshold refers to that point at which an action potential is generated along that motor neuron. So a low threshold motor neuron is one that does not require a large or large magnitude input to discharge versus a high threshold motor neuron, which requires a greater bioelectrical input to discharge that motor neuron. So if we begin with a voluntary muscle contraction, a conscious voluntary contraction that begins in the motor cortex, we see that very long axons of these upper motor neurons will transmit bioelectrical signals and synapse onto an alpha motor neuron. And when it does, that activates the muscle fibers. So the muscle fibers here, this is obviously a typo here. So the muscle fiber will shorten, and that muscle fiber is an extrafusal muscle fiber. The gamma motor neuron is also activated, and when that gamma motor neuron is activated, it will activate intrafusal muscle fibers. So both muscle fibers are activated and will be triggered to perform a contraction, remembering that the extrafusal fibers are the ones that are responsible for the production of overall muscle force, and the intrafusal muscle fibers do not contribute to overall muscle force, but will change the sensitivity of the muscle spindle to changes in muscle length. So this ends our first video on part 2 of the somatosensory system.